Good afternoon. On behalf of the organizers of the Popcorn Forum, I would like to welcome you all to North Idaho College. The Popcorn Forum is in its 33rd year. Isn't that amazing? And it has been a most ambitious undertaking this year, involving 13 organizations and 8 regional colleges, all dedicated to the theme, Confronting Hate, Humanity's Greatest Challenge. Today, Friday, our theme has been moving from hate to hope through education. And it is my privilege to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker today, Mr. Ken Stern. Now, time considerations limit my listing of Mr. Stern's incredible credentials. But in brief, Mr. Stern, a specialist on anti-Semitism and extremism with the American Jewish Committee of New York City. He began his distinguished career as a lawyer beginning in Portland, Oregon, after graduating from Willamette University School of Law. He has argued before the U.S. Supreme Court. He has testified before Congress. He is a prolific writer, winning many awards. He's a popular speaker on countless college campuses, a frequent guest on talk radio, and also on some of our favorite television shows such as Dateline, Nightline, Good Morning America. Most recently, Mr. Stern has written and spoken about the upsurge of anti-Semitism on college campuses. And close to home, he serves as a board member of Gonzaga University's Institute for Action Against Hate. As he addresses the need for an academic discipline of hate studies, please join me in welcoming Mr. Ken Stern.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, and good afternoon to you all. It's a pleasure to be here. I was here many years ago with Tony, and it's just a testament to something truly amazing about what's happening here. I mean, I travel all over the country, and to see this kind of continuation of emphasis on a particular problem of hatred and human rights, it gets speakers from all around the country and focused on what's happening here is just a real treasure and a treat, and it's a real testament to the work of Tony Stewart. So it's a pleasure to accept his invitation to spend some time with you folks here today. I think that, in my view, there's no more critical issue than the idea of hate and coming to grip with how we deal with it and what we have to do with it. As you heard in my introduction, I've been involved with the American Jewish Committee since 1989, dealing with issues of extremism, anti-Semitism, the whole gambit. And each time I have to deal with a particular issue, I come back to the realization that anti-Semitism is but a subset of the human capacity to hate, that it's a constant, that throughout history, people have always had the capacity to divide up, classify somebody as another, and sometimes, in the worst case scenario, have genocide be the result, have that hatred lead to violent action. And it doesn't matter whatever variable you want to slice and dice, no matter where, no matter when, no matter what the major religion is, no matter what the economic system is, any variable you care to look at, it's always been part of the human capacity for as long as there have been human beings. Now, there have been organizations like mine, the Anti-Defamation League, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, Southern Poverty Law Center, so on and so forth, that deal with some of these issues. I think sometimes well, sometimes not so well. But there's a big gap there that continues to trouble me. And that's that there's no academic system that's driving analysis and theory in terms of what we as human beings should be doing about this. If you think about it, human beings have the capacity to become ill, so we have a field of medicine that is more than its component parts of chemistry and biology and other associated fields, and they combine together to create something bigger than the sum of the parts, because there's a human need, because people get ill, so we need to address it. Or architecture. People need shelter. So there's a field that combines more than physics and mathematics and other related fields to create something dedicated to this human problem, human condition. There's nothing like that when it comes to hatred. There are little bits and pieces in different academic fields, many social sciences, in political science, social psychology, psychology, history, anthropology, sociology, so on and so forth. But each is captive of its own particular way of looking at things and only sees a part in isolation. There's no holistic bringing together of what the important parts are of these different academic fields to address this basic human problem. Now, what is hate? It's a very difficult concept to really discuss. It's unclear. I have a friend who's a research director of the National Conference of Community and Justice, who wrote a piece on Hate, a Concept Examined. And she went through the literature of how is hate defined, what do we know about it. And these are the conclusions that Renee Cohen came to. There's no common definition of hatred. There is a little bit more agreement on definitions of prejudice and stereotype, but nothing dealing specifically with hatred. There's a spectrum which he defines of negativity, sometimes emotion, sometimes attitude, sometimes behavior. And she sees two intersecting dimensions from passive to active, in other words, from thought to behavior. But she sees very little research that pulls together what we know about hate. Let me just read you very briefly what her conclusion is. She said, there is so little research examining hate and its related aspects in the social scientific literature that one must look closely at related areas such as prejudice and stereotyping to begin to build a useful body of work on hate. Yet that body of work will still need to be diverse in its content, flexible in its embrace of emerging areas of inquiry. Theories need to strive to synthesize insights from areas such as religion, philosophy, and literature. Similarly, research delineating active hate from prejudice and demonstrating an explicit relationship between prejudice and hate, or identifying prejudice as a form of hate, is also needed. Now, as much as I like Dr. Cohen and what she's pointing to, what she writes has nothing to do with ideas of politics and theology, other things that drive hatred. She's just looking at the individual role of what motivates people, not the larger terms. And that's part of the problem. Even when we try to identify and say there's not enough research, we don't look at the larger aspect of things. And that's why I think a field of hate studies is critically important. Part of the problem also is that we're dealing with inartful terms. And at time to time I come back and say, well, maybe hatred or hate is a term we should leave behind and look at something like, otherism, how we define others and deal with that as human beings. But from however we want to define it, I think first there are some commonalities that I've been able to discern that bring together pieces from the different academic fields, and then I'll go with you some questions about things we don't know but need to know. Here are some basic observations about hatred I've noticed over the years. First, hate of others is frequently expressed as love of self. If you read David Duke, the former KKK leader, who's a neo-Nazi at heart, he will say, and he's as truthful as he can be when he says this, he says, I don't hate black people, I just love white folk. For him, he would be happy if black folk didn't exist, but his motivating factor he sees is love of white folk. Louis Farrakhan, the flip side, the Nation of Islam leader, says, I don't hate white folk, I just love black folk. So the commonality there is the hatred is really expressed by the people who promote it most as love of their own self. It could even get more twisted. If one of my favorite quotes from Ayatollah Khomeini does not only the loving of Muslims and Islam, but defining the hatred of his victim as somehow loving them. Listen to this quote. It says, if an infidel is allowed to pursue his nefarious role as corrupter on earth until the end of his life, his moral sufferings will go on growing. If we kill him, and we thus prevent the infidel from perpetuating his misdeeds, this death will be to his benefit. In other words, that we're doing him a favor too, is showing love for the person we hate by killing them. Okay, so that's one construct in which all this works. Second, and to me this is perhaps the most important thing that I'd like you folks to come away with, hate is normative. Okay? Hate is a normal part of where human beings are at. My organization has a poster that we tend to throw out whenever there's an incident of a hate crime someplace. I'm the only person in my agency who absolutely detests it. It's this cute little poster of these cuddly little babies. Maybe you've seen them all in diapers sitting around. It's a diverse group of babies, and the caption on it is, "No one is born hating." I think that sends the absolute wrong message. It's true that no one is born hating. Nobody is born speaking either, but we all have the human capacity to speak, and when we don't speak, that's seen as somehow outside of the norm. I think the same thing is hatred. I think we're hardwired to react to hatred, to see hatred, and what we need to do is to develop ways to counteract what I think is a normal human aspect of functioning. Thirdly, I think a lot of what we deal with hatred has to do with multiplicity of layers of identity. We tend to think of people and put them in boxes in almost singular ways. But if you think about it, we're all a jumble of multiple identities. I'm an American, I'm a Jew, I'm a husband, I'm a father. Some of you have gotten to know me, know that I'm a fisherman. There are other ways that we define ourselves. But I think what happens sometimes is when one aspect of identity, usually dealing with race, ethnicity, religion, becomes supercharged, that is an area where a lot of the problems tend to be developed. One of the interesting experiences I had over the years when the militia movement stuff was hot, and I had written a book about it, I was on a radio show in Chicago with a guy named Jim Coates, who's a great reporter for the Chicago Tribune, wrote a book about skinheads and others, and was really very depressed because this was right after a lot of exposés of Timothy McVeigh came out, and it happened that Timothy McVeigh loved this book that Jim Coates wrote. He wrote it to keep kids away from the skinhead movement, and McVeigh twisted it and turned it around and said, "This is great stuff, everybody should read this." And when we were on the show, the only difference that we had is to the answer to the question, who belongs to the militia movement? And I was describing, I said, well, nobody's done any sociological research, no analysis, but anecdotally, it's the losers you'd expect, but it's also successful business people, people who are college educated, it's across the spectrum. Jim's answer was it's all the losers, the people from the alienated youth, broken homes, and so forth. And I realized, thinking about it afterwards, that on some level we were both right. I have a friend who you may know named Ken Toole, who's the head of the Montana Human Rights Network, and he described the militia movement as a funnel moving through space. And at the wide end of the funnel, there were people being sucked in on issues of gun control, federalism, and so forth. As we moved in a little further, they were being animated by conspiracy theories and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And at the small end of the funnel were the people that were really, raring to go and getting involved in a war. And those were the people with the supercharged identities, in my view, and those were the losers from Jim Coates' view. So when you look at a movement, it has various different components to it, but the identity aspect, I think, is very important. Fourth observation, I think life and death images are very important. I mean, we're all on some level, fear death, we know that it's there, but when you deal with these identity issues, when you read the literature, it's very clear that people see it an identity, a death and an identity of their group. Read the white supremacist literature, it's filled with the idea that white folk are going to go away. Black supremacist literature too, as well. And you see it even in our culture and in other identities. If you watch basketball, the NCAA or the NBA or baseball or whatever, and try to pay attention to how many life and death images are played out in the commentating of the sports announcers, because it's an identity that we see, and a team loses, it's the equivalent of death. If it goes on to the next round, it's equivalent of life. That's all part of a lot of our culture, and it deals a lot with the issues of how we see our identity and hatred and so forth. Fifth, symbols are incredibly important. From studying the Holocaust about the power of the swastika and how it was used. But flags are important. The debate about the Confederate flag, the Ku Klux Klan crosses and so forth. For skinheads, how they dress and the music they listen to. And it becomes more broad than just the traditional symbols. People and movements could become symbols too at dealing with a lot of this identity. To give you one example, I was in New York at the time when the mayor was Ed Koch and Jesse Jackson was running for president. And you may remember, though most of you are way too young, when Jackson was quoted as calling New York Hymietown. And Koch, the mayor of New York at the time, said, quote, Jews and supporters of Israel would be crazy to vote for Jesse Jackson. Now, he also said that because Jackson, right before that, had been quoted as saying that he was sick and tired of hearing about the Holocaust, and this was right after he had gone to a Holocaust museum. Now, Jackson, just so you know, is somebody I like, is somebody I converse with, and I think he's undone a lot of the damage that he did 15 years ago. But the point is that Koch actually lost the election in New York and was criticized very deeply for those statements. One of the things that I do in my daily work is I twist around things, put different people by different color of skin or religion or sex or sexual orientation, see if the same scenario applies. And if he did that here, imagine a white politician referring to Washington, D.C. as Amos and Andyville and coming out of an exhibit of slavery and saying he's sick and tired of hearing about slavery. And somebody saying, blacks and anybody who cares about human rights and civil rights would be crazy to vote for this person. I think everybody would have accepted that. And the reason why there was a double standard, or at least part of the reason, was that Jackson was seen as a symbol of aspiration, a symbol of hope. And attacks on him were deflected away as somehow we can't tolerate it because it's an attack of our own identity and our own desire to achieve success. Another example of symbols, something that we very rarely think about, but think about sports teams and mascots like the Cleveland Indians. We accept that in our society, but can you imagine a symbol with the idea of a Hasidic Jew for the New York Jews with give away yarmulkes on Yarmulke Day, or the Washington Blackskins, with all the appropriate stereotypes. We'd never tolerate that, but we tolerate it when it comes to American Indians. And I was speaking at a conference dealing with these issues at the University of Illinois, which has Chief Olinowick, who prances and dances at halftime and so forth. And it was very clear by the reaction of alumni and others that this was such a strong part of their identity, they were unwilling to see the rest of this. I mean, at one point I said to these folks, people come to the University of Illinois for a great many reasons. They're spending tens of thousands of dollars. I bet you can't find one that says, gee, I'm going to go to that university because it has a great mascot. Not one. They change the mascot, the football team wins, they'll cheer. If the football team loses, they won't. But there's something very strong with the symbol that we attach to identity that has a lot to how we deal with hate. So that's one other construct. 6, that lots of times hate is expressed around theories which sound credible, but twist science and history to promote the idea of credibility. Holocaust denial, which I've written a lot, does that. To give you a quick example, Holocaust deniers say that the Anne Frank diary is a fraud. Why? Because they can point to a copy of a manuscript of the diary that had ballpoint pen. Why is that a problem? The ballpoint pen is a post-war invention. Ergo, the Anne Frank diary was a fraud. Okay? What they don't tell you is that the writing in ballpoint pen was done by her father, Otto, emendations on a later copy of the book, and that it was first published in 1947, before the ballpoint pen was invented. Actually, it was the first published by the American Jewish Committee. But so they twist things just to create the image of hatred. Afrocentrism does that too. 7th, conspiracy theories are very much a part of how hateful ideologies are spread. And 8th, and I think this is something that to me is critical, because when people look at issues of hatred, especially in psychology and sociology, they tend not to recognize what to me is a critical component of is the political function of hate, the purpose that it serves in politics. Now, briefly, some questions. And there are a gazillion questions about hatred that we don't have the answers to, that an academic field would help us try to identify. Where does hate and its various manifestations, including racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, and so forth, where do they come from? What motivates individual hate? Do we need to hate? And if so, why? How exactly do these life-death images that I've spoken about work? Do we need to somehow feel these strong emotions to feel alive, including hatred? Is fear of death of group identity an extension of fear of death of self, or is it something else? How do hateful ideologies skew our vision so that dangers to our existence are seen in every aspect of human life? If you read the white supremacist literature or so forth, you see it in talking about culture, about religion, social and global changes, and so forth. When and why do different hateful ideologies find common cause? And one of the things that I do when I give a presentation on hate on the internet, which is fascinating, you can find a black supremacist website that has the ideological backbone of saying that whites are devils, and just real vicious gutter hatred of whites. And then you find a white supremacist website that has the same feeling towards blacks. They're not even human beings and so forth. And you see that they're 2 mouse clicks away from each other. And what's the connective tissue? It's anti-Semitism in general and Holocaust denial in particular. Or one of the things I'm writing about now, in the anti-war movement, there's a growing tendency between left and right, the Pat Buchanans on the right and some folks on the left, Alexander Cockburn, Rights for the Nation, and some others, to find common cause, again, around issues of anti-Semitism, but linking together visions of hate from entirely different points on the political spectrum, but finding common cause and writing about it and saying that we should work together. What role does self-esteem play in all this hatred? Is there a correlation between how much we hate the other and how strongly we feel connected to or good about ourselves? Bigotry has to do with identities. When and how are they formed and influenced and changed? And if we can't change them, how can we at least manage them? What's the role of education in all this? And I'm going to be speaking about this in a panel later on. I think that we have a lot of assumptions about what education does that the facts don't bear out. I think that education, in some ways, is a mantra that we say education is needed to combat hatred, and we don't know if it works. And I'll talk more about that later this afternoon. What should government and social change agents, the type of organizations that I work with, the NAACPs and so forth, what should we be doing that we're not doing? Why are some differences more important for defining others, such as skin color versus eye color in some places, like here, but in other places where those differences don't exist, people find the capacity to invent them. For example, there was a study of Greeks and Turks in Cyprus, and where the people are basically indistinguishable from each other physically, and they tell the difference between each other by basically things like what brands of cigarettes people are smoking. What's the role of dehumanization in all of this? What's the role of demonization? Why are conspiracy theories so prevalent? If you draw a graph between the human thirst for universality on one hand and the human, it seems to me, need for tribalism on the other, how does hatred play out on this axis? What motivates group hate? What makes it stronger? What makes it weaker? What's the role of stress, of fear, of envy, of race, of power, of land, of economics, of sovereignty, of religion, of memory? How do individual pathologies, group pathologies, political ideologies, and theologies mesh in all this? What's the role of rage, of biology, of sex? When and why do people act differently than they feel? There are studies in social psychology, for example, that asked, I think this was back in the 30s, asked people who were hotel and motel owners, and restaurateurs actually, would you serve Chinese people? And they said no, but when the Chinese people showed up as part of this experiment, they did serve them. Flip side is, why would people who say they wouldn't vote for David Duke end up voting for David Duke? Other examples as well. Is hate ever a good thing? I can probably create an example that sometimes in certain places it has perhaps had a role in World War II, not in terms of the Japanese Americans, but perhaps in terms of rallying the country in terms of the Nazis. What, again, is the role of politics, and how do concepts of nationalism and patriotism fit in? Attitudinal surveys, basic thing. Are they asking the right questions because they're so motivated by looking at the straight line of individual attitudes and not having the broader field of hate studies to look at? I mean, one of the things, again, David Duke polled very low, people voted for him, or one of the things I'm looking at now, which is a real disconnect. If you look at the polls on anti-Semitism, relatively low. The ADL had a poll a few years ago. It said 12%, and leave aside the argument of how that was defined and what that really means and the problems with it. 12%, this last poll jumped to 17%. Said, however, that attitudes that were anti-Semitic among people on college campuses was 3%, much lower, right? Where have I been dealing with the problems in the last 2 years? It's been more often on college campuses than not. So what does that mean? Does that mean that 3% is more active? Perhaps. Or does it mean that the attitudinal surveys are wrong, that we're asking the wrong questions, that traditionally we're thinking of things like, when people live next door to a Jew, do you think Jews are greasy or slimy or whatever? And those are the types of questions that we're still asking when there's something else playing out in the new manifestations of anti-Semitism that to me are much more politically based. So that's all part of the pie. We may be asking the wrong questions in our social research. A lot of the polls also seem to have the premise that you can say people are anti-Semitic or racist or not, or homophobic or not. And I think the larger construct to me is that we all are, to some degree. I think the answer is 100% of people are, or close to that. And the question is how we deal with it and what level of it and how strong or weak it is, as opposed to some are problems and some aren't. Okay. A few other questions. What should the role of government be in dealing with issues of hatred? We have, in the last 10 years, thankfully gotten the government motivated to count and categorize hate crimes, which is an important thing. But should there be other things? For example, I wrote right after Crown Heights, which was this riot, anti-Semitic riot in Brooklyn, that maybe the government should do something like it does when it requires an environmental impact statement, when the government's going to go out in the woods and do something. Maybe there should be some sort of an impact statement in terms of human rights. Should there, for example, if somebody in the Parks Department in the city of New York is going to develop a basketball program, maybe they should think through, is this an opportunity to bring together kids from different communities to somehow make contact with each other and break down stereotypes? Is that a role for government to try to think about ways to manage those types of issues? If education works, the tolerance education, and like I said, I have my serious doubts, but assume for the sake of argument that it does, should government not be mandating it in schools? I mean, think about it. When we say that a child has to have a certain level of education to graduate high school and proceed in an increasingly diverse world, we would never say, well, okay, it's for reading, let's bring in an outside program for a week in third grade, and we'll have them come back and do something in middle school, and we'll have them come back again in high school for a week, and that's all they need to do about teaching reading or teaching math, for example. But that's how we deal with these issues of diversity and dealing with hatred. And if education does have a role, and I think we're a long way away from defining what it should be, but if it does, and I think ultimately it will, it should be something that is included in the basic curriculum and not having outside groups come in and deal with it. Why doesn't the government quantify the cost of hate, the cost of discrimination? And is that a role for government to somehow ask the questions of what's the annual dollar bill for all this? Lots of questions. I can go on forever with the questions of things we don't know. But here's, to me, the problem and the need for the academic field of hate studies. We tend to think if hate is a mental disorder, that psychology is the cure. We tend to think if economics is the problem, and I could talk about that because I don't think it is, we wait for the next upcycle. If politics is a problem, then we wait for change in politics, which is the real detestable answer I get from French officials, seeing the level of anti-Semitism in France and the incredible number of violent attacks and arsons and so forth. It's sort of like, well, it's all because of what's happening in the Middle East. When there's peace in the Middle East, we won't have to worry about it anymore. Well, gee, thanks a lot. If it's a racist fringe, then you call in the FBI. If it's a lack of education, then educate. If we see it as an individual, the answer in the academic field is we go to psychology. If we see it as group, we go to the sociologist. If it's cultural, we go to the anthropologist. If it's political, we go to the political scientist. If it's a moral problem, we go to the philosophers. But it's a whole problem, and we're just going to the individual tangents. I mean, there's a big elephant of hatred charging us, and it's growing bigger all the time, and we're identifying, one group sees the tusk, one sees the trunk, one sees a hoof, so forth. Nobody is putting this all together to make a holistic picture. I think it's critically important that we do this now, and I'll give you a few reasons. One is that isolated answers in these various fields tend more often than not to be wrong. I'll give you an example. One colleague of mine who I met during the militia heyday is a very bright guy named Gerald Post. He's the head of the political psychology department at George Washington University. And here's what he said talking about the militia folks. He said, "A little skepticism is healthy, but a deep craving for enemies is a spiritual crutch. You start with alienated or unsuccessful people, feed them mind-numbing suspicions and rationalizations, and before you know it, you've gotten, quote, patriotic resistors who say government is an agent of the Antichrist." Okay, that's fine for where it goes. How does that explain the bin Ladens of the world, who are not alienated, who are certainly not unsuccessful, who are very rich, very educated, and animated with a murderous type of hatred that those of us in New York are reminded of every day when we look up at the skyline? Or how about Hezbollah? There was a recent study of this group that's based in Lebanon, and we tend to think, as Gerald put out, people that are dealing alienated, life of crisis and so forth. The people that made up Hezbollah, which is the first wave of the suicide bombers, were ones that tend to be more educated, more successful, more integrated, less alienated. These are people driven by ideas. And if we just look at, again, the aspect of the psychological point of view from where Gerald comes from, without bringing the political science aspect of it and the historical aspect in the same puzzle, I think we have problems, okay? Or another expert, it was making the case after Buford Furrow went and shot up the kids at the JCC in Los Angeles and also killed a Filipino postal worker. He was making the case in an op-ed in the New York Times that extreme racism is a mental disorder. And I understand why he was making that case. He wanted, and he said, he wanted to create an opportunity for having a diagnosis so people like Buford Furrow, before they start pulling triggers, would be more likely to be caught in the web of the mental health system and treated. And that was commendable for what he was doing. But what he didn't look at is the other side of this, the other fields. Law, for example. My background is as a lawyer. If somebody has what's called a mental disease or defect, that's a defense in a criminal case. So is he setting up a definition that will make it so that the Buford Furrows and other people that go out and commit hate crimes would have a defense built in based on the psychological aspect? Okay? Or look at the larger issue. Right after 9/11, there was a poll done in Pakistan where this, again, this conspiracy theories, these anti-Semitic theories about Jews were somehow behind 9/11, that there were 4,000 to 5,000 Israelis who were told to get out of the World Trade Center. There's a whole mythology of it that, that Mossad made up the list of who the hijackers were secretly controlling, so on and so forth. 48% of Pakistanis, a month after 9/11, believed that it was Jews/Israelis secretly behind 9/11. That, to me, is a pathology. Are you going to declare that half of Pakistan are extremely racist under that psychological view? So it, again, doesn't bring in the whole picture. I think we need that whole picture, and it's critically important now. Let me give you some reasons. One, if you look ahead and believe the statistics, by the middle of this century, we're going to have a majority in this country of non-white people. And, there are a lot of us for whom that, so what? One of the reasons why I moved back to New York is I love going on the train every day and seeing people reading in, Chinese, Japanese, Russian, Yiddish, all the different languages in the newspapers. But there are some people for whom this is a very frightening thought. And you worry about the Pat Buchanans and what they're trying to preach, and the fact that these ideas have had some traction in other parts of the world, Le Pen in France, for example. So now is mostly a critical time to get a handle on these images and these problems. In the world, global circumstances, have changed. I think one thing that we don't ever talk about, and to me it's probably one of the most critical things that's happened in the last 10, 15 years, is the impact of the fall of the Soviet Union, and the impact of that on our identities and hatred and so forth. I wrote about it a little bit in my book, and some other people like Leonard Zeskin have talked about it. With the militia movement, for example, if you followed their ideology and what they were saying, they took the old line John Bircher, the evil empire communist conspiracy theories, and very quickly after the fall of the Soviet Union kept those same theories alive but just changed the players, hit the delete key for the Soviet Union, inserted the U.S. federal government, and the same ideas percolated. That explains a lot of what was happening over in Noxon with Trockman and so forth. But those same implications have a part in what we're seeing now in the rise of the Islamist world. And by that I'm not meaning Islam, I'm meaning the Islamists, the people that have the politicized vision of Islam that see Christians and Jews as infidels and are really, trying to kill us. The fall of the Soviet Union has created for them a paradigm where there's one superpower left, and they see themselves, with a billion of people, as potential counterforce to America, as a new superpower. Anti-Americanism, which in many places really functions very much like any other type of prejudice that we find, racism, anti-Semitism, with the conspiracy theories and the other constructs, is on the rise, partly because we're the only game in town and nobody likes, the big strong bully. So that's something else that's impacting hate. I think it's going to make it more critical in our time, especially when we're talking about some of these folks that have had, access to capacity to kill, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. 9/11, again, has totally, changed, our world. And again, from looking at the issue of anti-Semitism, which I deal with most, I've been seeing in the last couple of years is almost as if history's on a fast forward. Those of you who are old enough to remember, I think 1968 was a year that always struck me. And when I was a kid, I was 15, that all the events kept happening. It almost seemed that history was going on fast forward, and it was scary and exciting. Well, in the last couple of years regarding anti-Semitism, it's been very similar. It's very incredible to remember that it was a little just over 2 years ago where my usual debate when I talked to Jewish audiences was they were saying, well, is anti-Semitism dead? They looked at the attitude surveys. They looked at Joe Lieberman, an Orthodox Jew yet was on a national ticket for vice president, and they were arguing, is anti-Semitism dead? Look what's happened in the last 2 years. The collapse of the peace process and all hell breaking loose in the Middle East, and as part of that, hate crimes against Jews around the world. Durban, the World Conference Against Racism, which was the greatest orgy of anti-Semitism that I ever saw, where you had people distributing Mein Kampf, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, talking about Jews in horrible ways, and what's even worse, taking the language of human rights and twisting it in a way to not only to be critical of Israel, which you certainly can be critical of Israel. I'm critical of lots of things that happen in Israel without being anti-Semitic, but using it as a way to castigate Jews and doing it in classically anti-Semitic terms. And after 9/11, the type of conspiracy theories to which I mentioned, and then things that we're seeing again in the Iraq War with the Buchanan statements and some on the left echoing that. I mention that only because historically anti-Semitism is really a miner's canary of how we deal with issues of bigotry. Anti-Semitism historically has started with Jews but doesn't end with Jews. So to the extent that I've been much busier in the last couple of years dealing with issues of anti-Semitism on a much wider, larger, more significant plane than in the prior 10 years, that to me is a troubling thing and an expression of why we need to deal with these critical issues now. What might a field of hate studies do? Create a common vocabulary, which I think is critically important. Integrate systems and research. Bring a better understanding of the whole field. Guiding action of a variety from individuals to groups to governments and so forth. I think what needs to spur critical research and debunk some of the myths about what we think education does and doesn't do, and find other ways as well of attacking the problem. I think it would create discussions about other types of opportunities. And one of the things I think we should revisit is the whole idea of national service. Not as the idea of a draft, but the idea, for example, of taking high school students at the last couple of months I remember when I was a high school student, that was basically a time to party. and taking kids from different backgrounds, perhaps, and putting them together and saying, take a black kid from urban Chicago and a Hispanic kid from Texas and a Jewish kid from LA, and make a group of 4 or 5, 6 kids and send them to some other community to work for 3 or 4 weeks with a local community there, an Indian reservation here, Puerto Rico, whatever, and mix and match and give them a common identity and a common purpose, and to do something to better America. I mean, things like that, I think, would grow out of the type of research that I'm talking about. I think there would be residual benefits just from having the focus of attention on the issue that an integrated field would bring. The FBI, for example, profiles serial killers. It doesn't profile hate crime offenders. I think it's something that we should think about doing, getting more information. Look at the impacts, again, the example of Crown Heights that I gave, report cards, analysis of costs, and so forth for government. I think it would help groups to see all aspects of bigotry as interrelated. I would think, I don't know this, but I would hazard a guess, if you went to an individual Hispanic or black person or Jew or gay person, whatever, they would somehow think all their experiences are somehow isolated and wouldn't understand how, if you attack racism, that also potentially has an impact on attacking homophobia. How, if you attack anti-Semitism, it has an impact on attacking sexism. How these things are related, and how if we coordinate and bring together systems to deal with this as a holistic problem, we'll have a better grasp of how to work together to fight hate. Policy issues, I think, would give us a better understanding of how to deal with issues like immigration, integration, intergroup relations, let alone foreign policy. One of my concerns with what we're doing now with Iraq, regardless of if you think it's a good idea or a bad idea, I didn't see any discussion that took into account a lot of the things I'm talking about, how this will deal with identity, how this will deal with ideas of hatred, what will be the real rubber meeting the road type of thing. I was looking at the bombing pictures and trying to think, if I was watching Al Jazeera, what would this say to me? And we don't have that type of analysis that I think we need to do. I think on campuses it's critical not only to have this type of program going, but it would also provide opportunities for case studies. Some of the problems I've dealt with over the years, there's one professor, for example, at Wellesley, who is writing and teaching anti-Semitic, vile conspiracy theories, Jews are ordained to try to control African Americans type of stuff, stuff in this classroom. Wouldn't it be great if there were a hate studies program at Wellesley so that you could use this as a case study? Again, when I was dealing with the militias, there was very little attitudinal research on who these folks were. It was all anecdotal. So if we had a field that really looked at these, as the issues came up, I think it would spur more research. I think ultimately what we need is a type of Manhattan Project that deals with the issue of hatred. We haven't had that type of attention since right after World War II. Theodore Adorno wrote The Authoritarian Personality. There were a lot of other types of studies of the social sciences. For a few years, my organization helped push some of that, as did some others, but it's really sort of dried up with that type of, we have to have the answers, we have to do the research, we have to bring together what we know. I think it's important and critical that we do that now. To conclude, my friend Bill Wasmuth, who we all sorely miss, said at one time about this subject, he said, "We do the best we can, but there is a sense that we are shooting in the dark. We need a better understanding of what works and why." I think that's critical. All the actions of community groups, we're all sort of shooting in the dark, national as well as local. We think we know what we're doing, but we don't have any testable theories to say, does this work, doesn't this work, how do we refine it to make it better? And if we had a field, that would happen. And in conclusion, I want to say that one of the things I'm very excited about, and it was mentioned in the introduction, that I'm on the board of the Gonzaga Institute for Action Against Hate. Our plan is next year, approximately at this time, to pull together scholars who have looked at the issue of hate from different academic fields and bring them together for 2 or 3 days and give them the task of defining what their particular academic disciplines say, what part of the puzzle it would provide in this holistic idea of hate studies, how we should proceed, how do we get other colleges, universities around the country to take up a call for this, how do we really have a foundational discussion of hate studies and then take it out and really make it a reality so that 10 years or 15 years from now, there are 20, 50, 100, whatever places around the country that are really looking at this and pulling together in a way that says hatred is a human problem. It's been with us for a long time. It's very deadly. And if we don't look at it in a serious way, pulling together what we know from all the other fields and creating something dedicated to understanding it and controlling it and combating it, things are just going to get worse. Anyway, let me stop there and take your questions. Thanks.
Ken, thank you very much. I've known Ken a long time, and as Mona indicated, he is highly qualified and has contributed in so many ways, including even, it's a great honor to be able to argue before the U.S. Supreme Court and the Congress, and he's always accessible to us when we need information. A little later, he'll be on a panel with some of our faculty and with Gloria McMillan from the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and it'll be over in the Student Union. You'll get a chance to engage in dialogue, but we do have a few minutes. Ken, thank you for that very articulate presentation. I have the microphones we've been using this week, and if someone has a question, here's a great opportunity to ask it to a real expert in this field. Our good friend Jo Webb, I see her back here. Jo, you'll need this microphone. Yeah, you do, because we're recording it on TV, and they can't pick you up.
Well, I'm struck by the fact that there's nothing that you can tell a young person he should study at the college level. How can you tell some young person, look, this is what we need, and here's what you should be doing?
Well, the answer, I'm not saying there's nothing to be studied. I think there's a lot out there that's very good that needs to be studied. What I'm saying is that there isn't anything comprehensive that pulls together the various different aspects. And what I would, maybe it would make sense as a first step for various universities to pull together interdisciplinary courses so that somebody could decide, I want to study hate, so therefore I'll take some classes in psychology and social psychology, political science, history, and so forth, and be able to graduate with a focus on this particular problem. That may be a temporary type of answer to the problem. But I'm saying is that I would love to see the type of synergy that we could create from pulling what we know, and they're very, very valuable things. I don't mean to be misunderstood. They're not valuable in these different fields, but somehow make it all work together. Because, again, we're looking at parts of the puzzle and not the whole picture, and we need to be able to do that, to have answers that work, and that are not just responding to the narrow slice that they envision, but seeing the whole picture.
Other questions? Yes?
Do you see a problem with the different disciplines giving up their exclusive nature in what they're looking at and combining that together into a hate studies academic focus?
Well, I'm not advocating that we give up the different political fields. I'm saying that each of them focus on different aspects of things. Psychologists look at the whole psychology looks at the whole matter of how human beings, in their mind. The sociologists look at groups. Political science looks at, politics, so forth. I'm not saying that we're going to give up those fields. Those fields are important and critically necessary. What I'm saying is that each of them has a tangent, a part of it that focuses on an aspect of hatred. And what I'm saying is that if we pull together the various different parts of that and find things that interrelate better to create this whole, that's going to be bigger than the sum of its parts. So I'm not saying, there should only be hate studies and nothing else. I'm saying we need to pull from the various fields what they have to offer. Just like, the example I started with, if we take medicine, nobody's saying that we shouldn't have, chemistry and biology. Those fields are flourishing on their own. But we have the concentrated field of medicine because we need to look at this holistically because we have the problems of human beings getting sick. Same, metaphor to be used in hatred.
I think sometimes the problems we have is we don't know what we don't know. And I think that a lot of people don't know that this needs to be an area to study. I think that we, as the people here that have come to this forum and those of us who do this work, really need to advocate that people even start to understand that this is a question they should be asking. What kinds of studies should we be doing? Because if you think about spousal abuse and rape and all of those things have become the cottage industry lately. But before that happened, people didn't realize that that was something that needed to be learned, studied.
I think that's Gloria, I think that's a critically important point. And, that's why I think that what Tony does here is so exceptional, because it's so rare. I think there's almost a desire for people to turn the other way when things of hatred happen. It's distasteful, it's ugly, we'd rather focus on other things, and we tend to default to turning away from it. And that, I think, in the long run, I understand that is very dangerous. And you're absolutely right. I mean, if you think about in our lifetime, the cultural changes that have happened because of attention to particular problems, all of us, I don't know if some of the younger people, but those of us who are somewhat older remember when the idea of telling somebody in a restaurant they shouldn't smoke was, seen as you couldn't do that. You would never cross your mind. That's preposterous. But just in a matter of a couple of decades, we've changed it so that the default is, we understand what smoking does, and that, if you want to do it, go outside, don't pollute our, environment. Or the idea of drunk driving stuff. I was, practicing law in Portland in the early '80s when Mothers Against Drunk Driving started, and it was almost seen by some people as you had a God-given right to drink and drive as long as you didn't kill somebody, and that's really changed a lot. So you can, in a relatively short period of time, get people's attention focused on real problems, as long as you provide the concept, the roadmap, and really touch people where they're at so they understand the need to deal with it. And I think if we deal with that on a similar model with these issues, we can have success.
I'm reminded of the late 60s at my high school. Actually, it was West Valley in Spokane. And a group of our students decided we wanted to have a multicultural studies program from discussions after Martin Luther King's assassination. And the principal at the time said, well, we don't really need that here because we don't have any black people at our high school. And so I'm, in the context of hate studies, I could see some academic programs, college, university, say, well, we don't have enough hate here to develop one of those programs. You respond to that, Ken?
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. I think there are two aspects of it, Steve. That one is that for again, leaving aside, I think, some of the problems with some of the educational models, I think the places that have tried to incorporate those are ones that see it as a way of dealing with problems internally, rather than as, if you assume they work, that deal with the societal fact that hatred is an issue of society, that people are not going to necessarily all stay in a homogenous community and going to move elsewhere. So I think there's that aspect of it. But I think also that ultimately that people need to recognize that it's not an admission of failure when you say that we're going to deal with a problem here. And I had that happen this last year. One of the things that I was dealing with after a series of incidents of anti-Semitism on college campuses, I worked with a small group of university and college presidents to put together a statement. And the statement was printed in the New York Times in October, and it was a very basic statement. It said, we as college presidents owe an obligation to our students and our community to not let people be intimidated. The idea of free expression we support fully, but it should not go over into thuggery, because we were getting reports of Jewish students who were feeling uncomfortable, observant, wearing yarmulkes, that people were protesting when there were rallies had nothing to do with Israel, but had to do with celebration of holidays. Kids who were afraid to go to certain classes for fear if they expressed their opinions on things in the Middle East, they were going to get lower grades. And so we had these presidents that came together with a strong statement and said, we promise an open campus without intimidation. Okay. A small number of college presidents refused to sign on and told me privately, that the reason is that they were fearful that their alumni and trustees and others would take it as an admission that there's a problem on the campus. And when I deal with college presidents on the issue of bigotry, and I have a program I've dealt with about 300 college presidents over the year, training them on how to deal with bigotry on campus, I say to them, you know, that you haven't had a major eruption doesn't mean that there isn't a problem. You have to look at the interactions between students on every day. You have to look at the curriculum. You have to look at a whole bunch of other things and survey it. You know, it's a societal problem. It's not a reflection of where you're at. So they have to understand that, and sometimes it's very difficult. You're right.
On that note, we're going to, you can come up and talk with Ken in a minute if you'd like to, but at 2:30 he'll be on a panel with the others. Then there's 2 workshops this afternoon with faculty from the University of Idaho, and then tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock there's a final workshop with faculty from Gonzaga and also from the University of a university in Canada. So thank you for coming. You've been so good all week to do that, and Ken will be here for a few more minutes if you'd like to chat with him. And again, have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you all. Thank you, Tony.